Brush textures are an extremely powerful way of sculpting high-frequency detail quickly using procedural patterns or images, like skin pores in a face or bark on a tree. Such patterns would take forever sculpting from scratch. So let's talk about the scene as I've set it up to demonstrate this. We have a subdivided sphere, pretty high in poly count, up to 1.5 million faces. And that's because brush textures are best whenever we have a lot of polygons. And so let's jump into the texture menu where we can create a new texture. Now this only creates a blank texture slot. So if I were to stroke onto the surface, nothing happens. And so we need to jump into that texture settings, which we can achieve with this button on the right. By default, it expects an image texture, but we also can use any of the procedural textures included with Blender, like these clouds, for example, which is a great generic noise pattern. And right away, that high frequency detail is achieved in seconds, but you can imagine how difficult that would be to do by hand. I encourage you to play with all of these textures, see where they could be useful. This distorted noise is going to be a slightly different noise pattern, almost like wrinkled fabric. The marble might be kind of interesting. Almost like a basic topographical map. Voronoi or wood. Yeah, wood is pretty disappointing. I don't know why the default settings aren't a little more wood-like, but Voronoi, that's another one that can end up looking sort of like an ocean, especially from an angle. But these procedural patterns definitely have their place. Image textures is where you can get very custom. So let's open an image, which we can find in the texture directory, brush text, and medieval wall. So this is a brick-like texture pattern generated from images. So it's going to be very realistic. And when we sculpt on the surface, we get that pattern. And that is awesome. So let's dive into the texture brush settings. First is mapping. And by default, the tiled setting, we can visualize in the cursor menu by texture opacity, turning that on. And it takes our texture and it repeats it or tiles it to our viewing plane. And this works fine whenever we are sculpting kind of in the middle of our object, the surface that's most directly facing our viewing angle. But as soon as we start to sculpt on surfaces that start to face more perpendicular to the viewing angle, it's essentially a projection which stretches, just like if we were using a projector to project an image onto a curved surface. And so the next type of mapping we have is, let's start at the top of the list, view plane. And if we turn on our texture opacity again, this locks the texture to our brush. So we're no longer tiling it across the 3D view, and every time you click, you kind of get a stamp of that pattern. Let me increase the strength to make that a little stronger. Or we can also disable pressure sensitivity on the strength. And yeah, that's going to be like a strong stamping effect. Now, it's based on the view plane, and so we have that same problem of projecting onto the more perpendicular surface, where we get that stretching. So if we switch to area plane, it's the same kind of thing, but it does orient the texture to the surface normal. All right, so we don't get any more of that stretching. Now at this point, let's switch things up and we'll name this texture brick, and then we'll remove it and create a new texture. We'll call it bolt. Just to see another use of image textures. And now looking at the thumbnail, we can see that the brush texture takes black values and applies no strength. White values apply full strength, and that's how we get the displacement effect. And so if we click on the surface, make my brush a little bit smaller, we get lovely bolt displacement stamps. Whereas if we did this with the view plane, that is not ideal. Now if we go back to area, I've been clicking individually on the surface, but these will follow the stroke you make. And you can see that it's kind of stamping over and over again along the stroke, which layers the effect. It does not work at all for this bolt texture, but if we jump over to our brick texture, we will lose the alignment of the bricks that we maintain with the tiled mapping. But still, this is useful as a generic noise type pattern. Even though we can still see a little bit of a repeating pattern, we have options to randomize it. And so now when I draw along the stroke, you can see that the orientation changes and we can no longer determine a repeating pattern. And this can also be useful if we jump back to the bolt texture and choose the single click method. It will change the orientation of the bolt randomly, right? So that's fun. There's also another setting here called rake. If I enable that, disable random, this will orient the texture to kind of follow the path of our stroke. And that might look a little strange with the bolt texture, but if we switch to our brick texture, lower the strength, we can end up getting kind of this tire track pattern. It's a little too subtle. And that's about it for the settings I wanted to cover. Let me see if I'm missing anything. Back to mapping types, there's a 3D type, which I never really use. There's also random, which I don't really use. I'll just prefer the random checkbox here. And then there's also stencil, which I will use when I want to be very precise with the type of stamping that I'm doing. In my opinion, this is the most controlled. It will project the texture in a square stencil, which we can move around by right-clicking and dragging. We can scale by holding Shift, right-clicking and dragging, and we can rotate by holding Control, right-clicking and dragging. And so we can, very precisely position a texture and then stroke and project that texture exactly how we see it in the viewport. It's going to be really strong, so let's take the strength down. And so this can be useful if I wanted to kind of project this brick texture progressively along the surface. It's very rare to see like a spherical brick implementation, but we can kind of achieve something by orienting the stencil in various ways and just blurring the border between stencil stamps. Let's take another look at the texture settings. We've got offset, which will move our texture around. We've got size, which will increase the scale. I very rarely ever touch these. I don't think I've ever touched sample bias. And a really big thing I almost skipped over is the fact that textures can be applied to any of our brushes, which can result in some pretty crazy behaviors. For example, let's take the inflate brush. If we choose our brick texture, and let's see, it also will reset the mapping. And I guess all these texture settings are per brush. And so if we start to stroke on the surface, you'll see that we get the inflate behavior within the context of the texture. Also, if we grab the grab brush and let's choose our bolt, we can click and drag out that texture, which is again reset to the tiled mapping. If we choose area plane, we can pull out the texture. Holding Control with the grab brush, we can very dynamically choose a strength for the stamp. And so these examples aren't exactly that crazy, but the pose brush can support the texture, which seems kind of crazy. So let's just try it, see what happens. Okay, so it does not actually support the texture. It has the option for it, but clearly has no reason to utilize a texture. So, okay, that's kind of a little weird, I guess. What about like slide relax? Okay, let's test this kind of on the fly. I'm going to pull out a snake hook and then we can look at the geometry. I mean, what happens if this slide relax gets a texture like the brick texture? That probably doesn't actually do anything. So I take it back. While we can apply a texture to any brush, only certain brushes make sense to have a texture. But there's a lot of room to play around with brush textures and how they engage with brushes. I highly encourage you to test it out, play with it. It's such a powerful feature within Blender Sculpt Mode.